Hello everybody, welcome back. Andy Spoons here, and I'm going to be doing a bit more talking in this video today. I'm going to basically show you what I would grab as soon as I walk out to just start axing out a blank, refining the edges, and then moving into the finer cuts and the finishing cuts. So enjoy! My setup is obviously overkill. There's more things than you would ever need to carve a spoon. First thing I would grab is an axe. So let's just put that down there. Next thing I will grab is a saw. My larger Twca cam, this is my large hook knife, a Sloyd knife. And then because we're talking about stock removal, my Drawknife. This is definitely an auxiliary piece of kit. You don't need this, but because I am outside doing some cooking spoons, I think that it'll just make my life a little easier. What I might also add if I was doing more cooking spoons is my Adze for the bowl work. This would be what I would say is the bare essential 4 pieces of kit that you need. An axe, a saw, a hook knife, and a Sloyd knife. Okay, so here we are at the axe block. I've got a loop there for my axe. I'll just put the knife over to one side, keep a couple of axe blocks around, and I'll put the Twca cam over to one side as well. The saw, I have a little screw in the front. I like to keep as much, especially for the heavy work, as much right within reach. When I have the throw, there's a little hook here that I slide it into. Got a brush because it's nice to keep the top of your block clean, and then I also keep a masonry mallet to hit the back of the throw. I know people use a large maul, but I find a mallet perfectly fine, and then this is where I usually put my adze. So let's grab a piece of silky oak and get started. I did also forget to mention I always have a pencil on me as well for drawing out the design. I'm using the Fadir Forge 860 gram carver. They're a fantastic company. So first thing I'm going to do is just square up this billet. This is a piece of silky oak. I think I might actually just axe because I don't think it's going to take that much time. Big thing to note when axing is imagine that you're imagine that you're holding a hula hoop is a way that I always describe it. So you've got this giant wrap around with your full swing in the way. So make sure that your leg, any part of your body, is out of the way of that follow through. So I tend to stand just off to one side, slightly bent knees. I tend to hold about a little above halfway on the axe. Let's get rid of some of the bark. And especially with big swings, I try never to come up above the 2/3 mark. I would recommend halfway for anyone starting out. So you can see it's got a big old wave to it, which I think might end up looking nice if I can tame it a little bit. But first what I need to do is just flatten everything out. Because what can happen is you can get a bit excited and start straight into the design and not realize that maybe just underneath the surface there could be a twist or a knot, which can certainly still happen throughout the process, but it's good to kind of, this tear out through here, it's good to get below that and figure out how the grain's going to react. Yeah, that bend might be a really nice feature. It also might shoot me in the foot later, so we'll see. So this is more than what I would usually do, squaring it out. I can kind of see where my square, you know, tops and sides are for the most part. I'm already making decisions about where the spoon's going to be. I wouldn't usually draw this, but basically, if you imagine that you've got a center line through here, I would probably end up, because this is a wider piece with most of the straight before it bends through here, I'd probably put the crank about there. I hope you can see that. Right there, maybe a little bit higher. Spoon will be something like this. Handle will be something like that. And then that way I'm gaining most of the straight grain, and there's a little wobble towards the back end of the handle, which I think might actually look really nice. So yeah, what I tend to do then, like I said, I don't often draw this, but what I do always do is I start from the bottom, because I feel like outlining that bottom shape gives me a better idea of how much material I have to use. So I tend to start with the bowl forward. You can use pretty broad brush strokes there, so that's good. And then back down, I'll do some stop cuts all the way up. And if you're not comfortable going straight down the middle, what I do recommend, let me clear this out first. What I do recommend is starting on a third, so 1, 2, 3. So starting on this edge, axing out one side, doing the same over here. And then finishing in your center line. So what I'm noticing is that my axe is diving right in, and I think it's because of all of this twist that's happening, which is making me question whether I should use this section of the grain. So what I'll do is I'll do a bit of exploratory axe work. Okay, so it cleans up a little bit more, which means that I just need to straighten this line, the underside, to get away from that squirrely grain. And this is why I like doing the bottom first, is because it's a little bit less commitment. If you start with the top and you work your way down and you start seeing the development of the spoon, you can get a little bit connected to it and attached. But I find if you start with the bottom, if something's feeling bad, you're more likely to just cut your losses and maybe, you know, make a smaller spoon, or a cooking spoon, or an eating spoon rather. So I kind of skipped a step. So what I was doing then is just gone through the bottom, and then I was just squaring off the sides again, just to make sure that I'm, you know, getting the most out of it. I'm pretty happy with how that's going. It's a little chunky on the underside there, so we'll just flatten that out. I'm doing much smaller cuts once I get up into this area. Again, I don't recommend doing this for someone who isn't comfortable with an axe. The alternative is just flipping it around, going that direction for more. Or you can place your axe and use the momentum of the work. So that's our bottom shape done. Now what I'll do is saw in the crank, You can also axe. I find that a saw is more accurate, but you can also cut a little bit too deep with a saw. I find that an axe is often, because it takes a little bit longer, you can kind of slowly get into the wood. But I recommend starting with a saw. It's a lot more controlled. So there's my crank depth. It's the lowest part of the spoon. And in this case, I'm going to do the same thing as what I was mentioning before. I'll go in thirds to get down to that depth. You can use stop cuts. You can, start through here and work your way back. I quite like trying to get a continuous line and wedging away. Oh, okay, so here's something. So what just happened then is it popped away a little bit and followed through there. So what I'll want to make sure, I'll draw what just happened. So I followed through and there's a split happening over here. So what I'll make sure I do is that I cut right underneath that to make sure that that doesn't get in my way at all. I'll axe that away. So I've done that one side. Let's do the second side. I'll see if I can do it this way so you can see what I'm doing. Trying to match up the sides. So this wood is really popping on me. I've gone through in the exact same fashion over here, but again, I'll be axing underneath that. So now that I've done the sides, I'll just flatten it out by going down the middle. Ooh, we're still okay, but I don't know if you can see that there's a funny little run of grain that I hadn't noticed until just then. I think that might give me some problems in a little bit. So I'm just going to flatten that out and see if I can get past it. I don't think I can. I think I'm just going to have to dive in and see where it goes. Well, that's not too bad. But these are the things that you're thinking about as you're working. And kind of making mental notes when I get to the knife work. This area is likely to give me some grief. Squaring things off again. And I'm kind of just doing things a little bit slower than I often would, just to be able to describe them. Now what I'll do, I might actually just adjust the camera down so that you can see what's going on. So what I'm doing now is I've axed down my crank and then I'm going to come back the other direction. It looks like my arm's a lot closer than it is, but you can see that there's quite a lot of distance. Position myself and I'm basically aiming at one spot on the axe block, and I'm rotating my work a little bit. So I'll start with my work not too deep, and then as I start to feel some bite, I'll kind of follow that down, and then I might rotate the piece just a little bit. I don't want to take too much at the start, because then you're working a lot harder than you need to. So it's much easier to take smaller pieces. That's a pretty straight line, so I think I'll just, now that I've made that space, I'm just going to work my way down as flat as I can. Yeah, something like that. And then just clean up this edge a little bit. Oh, one thing I should mention, this whole thing that I'm doing here is really bad practice. I don't often do this. I only do this when I'm tilting the work and swinging really small strokes. I'd always recommend keeping your fingers back away from that front surface as much as you can, because of obvious reasons. Because swinging an axe is fairly unforgiving if you miss. Okay, so this is starting to look more like a cranked spoon blank, and then what I'll do is just clean some edges up. Doing this kind of stuff early on in the process, just, I don't know, it just saves you a tiny bit of time in the long run, I find. Squaring everything up just makes your life easier. Okay, we're starting to look pretty good. I'm pretty happy with that. I'm just kind of fussing at this point. There's no need to fuss the way that I am. So now what I'll do is I'll draw my design, and I've had people ask me if I use templates, how I go through my motions. You know what? I keep on coming to this section. I'm going to saw this away. This isn't going to be a cooking spoon, because the more this bites and the more it peels the way that it is, the more I'm aware that it's just not going to work out in the end. So it's happened a couple of times throughout this, and I'm going to cut my losses. And that means that this is essentially going to cut off about there. I'll do that in a second. I'm going to draw my center line. So it is a shame that I can't get a cooking spoon out of this because of that shake. But to be quite honest, I would rather know that all of this grain is running pretty safely, rather than trying to, you know, get all the way through and then ruining the handle and having really weird proportions of a spoon later. So you've got to learn to cut your losses a little bit. So what I'll do, maybe I'll do a serving spoon then. I'll keep the bowl size quite large. Initially I was thinking an eating spoon, but we have the space. And a good personal rule of thumb is you want your spoon bowl 1/3 of the entire length of your spoon. So 1, 2, 3, say that. And then you want the crank line around 1/3 to 1/4 back from the front, or 1/3 down, 2/3 back, if that makes sense. It just makes for even proportion. Like I said, I do all of this freehand. Or maybe I didn't say that, but I do all of this freehand. And I find that I end up doing a little bit more adjustment once I get to the knife work. I tend to overdraw things a little bit more oversized. The actual spoon itself will be much more delicate than this. But I find that this is a more forgiving process than trying to draw it exactly to size. Maybe I'll eventually get to templates, but I'm not in a rush. So anyway, that's going to be a serving spoon size. We'll just get rid of all of this excess. I'll get the saw back using a Silky big boy. So what I do is I take the tops and bottoms off. Try and keep a pretty light hand once I get to the tip, because I don't want to put too much shock. And then I'll cut some stop cuts in here. There we go. I do 2. I have had people ask me why I do 2, and I like to think of it less as 2 cuts and more as 1 tab, if that makes sense. Because I've found that one stop cut can still bump through with enough force, whereas the tab is more likely to free up the pressure. And I'll show you why I do these stop cuts. I hope you can see this okay. So what I'll do is I'll place my axe at the top of the spoon blank, and then I'll just do a little bump cut. Let's just see what happens on the other side. Yeah, so that's actually a lot more forgiving than I was expecting it to be. There we go. The big spoon destroyer is when you go through the bowl like that, which is why I always go out of my way to make sure that these stop cuts are pretty bomb proof. And I'll pry the wood a lot throughout this process. What I also do as I'm axing to this point is I tend to pull my axe blow a little bit, just to make sure that I'm not burying it. So it's a good thing to get used to. It's almost flicking. You're flicking the axe into the wood, and then that way I can do something like this when I'm really pulling back on the stroke a little bit more. It gives you a lot more accuracy. So anyway, that's down to the handle. Then I try and keep, just for efficiency's sake, I try and keep all of my motions running in the same direction until I need to turn around. So down the handle, down this side, down that handle, down that side. I might just split off a little bit more just to see how it feels. Silky oak has some very interesting grain reaction, so it can sometimes be tricky to tell what's going to happen. There we go. So that was a little close there, but like I said, I always overdraw a little larger than it's going to be. Now I'm going to come back down this way, and what I tend to do is I'll do a little standing up like this on both sides, just for the sake of you being able to see what I'm doing. And then when I've kind of rounded that corner, it says the tab's not necessary anymore. When I've rounded the corner, that's when I'll switch to this. And I try and aim that direction rather than back, for safety, and also to make sure that I'm not axing back into the actual spoon bowl. And again, what I do is I try and axe down and rotate the work across so that my axe is actually not moving direction. It's just staying straight up and down, and the piece itself is moving. We don't need that tab anymore. I'll just get rid of the tab. Being really careful right there. And then we just reverse the sides. Again, straight down, adjusting my piece. And kind of burying it into that corner, because I'll end up getting rid of... Oh, here's another tip. So I'm aiming the axe into the block and keeping the spoon far enough away so that I actually can't get to the back of the bowl. It kind of means that you're not getting in that kind of trouble. So line things up here pretty nicely. There we go. So now what I'll tend to do is I'll go just back down the bowl. It doesn't look like I actually need to do too much on that front, so I'm actually going to leave it. Maybe just a little bit there, just to straighten things out. Yeah. And then I come back down from essentially the crank line back down the handle, and I'll tend to twist the spoon slightly, so I'll start with it more like this, and then I'll straighten it out as I go, and that's basically just so I can get the angle A little axe tip to get a bit more of a curve is start with more pressure on your blade and then relax your grip, and what will happen is the axe will just, it'll want to exit the wood. So starting with some pressure and then just loosening the grip, and it'll essentially just push its way out. And the same on the top. A little bit of pressure down, and then just relaxing the grip, and it'll pop its way out. And then you just do that for, you know, it's personal preference at that point. Okay, so that is about as far as I'll take it with the axe. I might actually switch to the Drawknife now, mostly because it's satisfying. So there's the axe work done. This is a spoon mule. It's a kind of quick grip vice apparatus. It basically allows you to do all of the grip with your legs. There are some jaws that come down, basically meaning that I can put this in, tighten things up with my feet, get myself positioned, and it's completely locked off, and it allows me to use something like a Drawknife without having to, you know, unscrew and rescrew things. So this is a small Drawknife, bevel up. This is by a man, Magnus Sundelin. But you can use any type of Drawknife on this kind of setup. So what I'll do is I'm basically just working my way back down to my lines. I tend to skew the blade slightly just to be able to make sure that it's a clean cut. I might actually move, there we go, that's better. And this, oh, so sorry, I can't get my feet settled here, just give me a second. Need to make sure that the jaws can close up all the way. There we go. So you can kind of see that I'm pushing relatively hard, but the spoon itself isn't going anywhere. And that gives me a much more polished, clean finish on this outside edge than an axe would do, without it taking a really long time. So I'm just bringing everything back down to the lines. You can flip things over. What I do sometimes use is just a small piece of wood, just to be able to grab a bit of an angle without pushing down too far. This piece of wood's actually a little bit too big. It's usually not this aggressive a grade change, but anyway, let's spin things over. Just little sections. I'm actually not going to bother with the piece of wood on this piece because I'm not putting that much pressure on. There we go. So it's just refining the lines and essentially saving your Sloyd knife from being worn out too quickly. So now that that's set up, I'll do the bottom and just, like I said, just level things out. what I might end up doing as well is re-flattening and redrawing the top profile, maybe. It's pretty flat actually, I might not. Sometimes I do, sometimes I don't. It depends how even everything's looking. This is actually looking not too bad, so I'm not too worried about that. Then it's just a matter of flipping it over and doing the same thing and leveling everything out. Starting on your edges, because I find that your edges are the easiest way to get a curve and to see the line, see your profile line. And then once you've got that set, you can go down the middle. That's just smoothing everything out, making sure things are relatively even. I might even just bring the handle in a little bit more still, because I know that I will once I get to the Sloyd knife. This saves me a little bit of work. I do have some more descriptions of this spoon mule and not so much designs. I recommend looking at someone like Dawson Moore, Michigan Sloyd, or Paul Boyer in Australia for spoon mule designs. They will happily sell them to you, or in Paul's case, build one for you. I believe actually Dawson builds as well, but I'm not sure how consistent that is. But you're welcome to go onto my Instagram page and have a look at some more comprehensive photos of this setup. So we're getting to a pretty good spot. Again, I think I'm just faffing at this point. Yeah, well, I might do a little just to see how it feels, and then I might redraw these angles later. Again, all this is doing is saving me from having to do this kind of work with my smaller knives. And it's also just fun, I'll be honest. I just enjoy using a draw knife. So why wouldn't you? Gives you a nice flat surface to redraw your design nicely. Okay, I think that's more than good enough. And I'll redraw, get everything looking tight, and then we can come back and maybe have a look at the adze. So there we go. Let's get to some adze work. This will be rather quick because this isn't a very deep bowl. It really isn't going to require much removal. So for those of you who aren't familiar, this is an adze. It's a radiused edge. I've put a bevel on the outside. It was continual at one point. I'll get into sharpening these in a different video, but the idea is that you hold it like so. Pretty comfortable grip, and my personal method is I like to sever the back fibers of the bowl, and then once those are all severed, I spin the spoon around and I work back into that area that I've severed. So for example, I also make sure that there's a really good solid foundation underneath, because it's really easy to snap a spoon because you're doing, you know, it's a fairly aggressive downward force. So again, relatively light. I'm really just letting the weight of the adze do the work here. I'm just aiming it, allowing the weight to kind of just chip through. Okay, and that's severed all of those back fibers. You can work forward if you'd like, but I tend to stop around there because I don't want to dig too deep. I just like the back being the deepest part. And then I spin it around. And what I'm doing is I'm basically wedging my leg. And in that same pulling motion that I was mentioning with the axe before, basically just chipping back until I get to a point where I'm going to free up the fibers. And it can sometimes look like I'm going to follow through, but because I'm doing this kind of, you know, tapping, flicking motion almost, I'm not striking through, I'm just allowing the edge to kind of come in contact with the grain, and then I'm moving backwards almost. So this is my own style process. This isn't for everyone. I know some people like to, you know, use a bit more of a heavy hand. But for me, this is a much faster process than, say, getting in there with a hook knife. Because, you know, before you know it, you're really on your way to having a finished bowl. It doesn't take much to clean this up. I tend to not need to get too close to the edges because at this point, really all the adze is there for is to sever all of the top fibers, that's the hardest part of hollowing out a bowl, is just getting started. And so this really just gets you started. So, you know, you can be fussy if you want. I tend to not be too fussy when it comes to the adze work, but there you go. So we've gone through all of the rough, larger material removal, and now we're into the finer detailing. I'm basically, because this is still green, what I will plan to do is just rough out the form, and then I will leave it, you know, in somewhere shady, somewhere fairly climate controlled, you know, in my office or somewhere like that, you know, not in direct sunlight on a shelf. And then I'll let it dry for a few days, and then I will come back and do all the finishing cuts. But basically, so this is my Twca cam, and we did all of that work with the adze, which really means I don't need to do almost anything but clean up the surface when it comes to bowl work. It's a really simple process that doesn't take that long at all. And again, because this is just the roughing, and I'll do the finishing cuts in a day or two, it doesn't have to be perfect. But it's nice to get it to the line, and, you know, it is still nice to leave a little bit of material on in case it twists while it dries. So that's worth noting, is that once the wood settles in, it can twist. But for the most part, it'll stay pretty stable. So as you can see, really all I'm doing is smoothing out all of these existing edges, which is nearly done. And that took me, I don't know, it didn't feel like that long. Now what I often do with smaller spoons, especially eating spoons, is I will do the underside first, because there is always a danger of getting a little bit too excited and carving the bowl a little bit too deep. Which, because this is a serving spoon, that's not a bad thing. You want to be able to hold a lot of material in it. But, you know, I find that eating spoons don't need to be very deep, so you can often overdo it a bit. I like to bring the back up and then work back in towards it, if that makes sense. So anyway, that's the bowl. Pretty close to good, you know. I could muck around with that for a little bit longer, but I won't. No, there's still a little bit in that edge. Just to, you know, getting rid of the adze marks is really all I need to do here, because those are the larger impact marks and they're harder to get rid of later. And doing all of this while it's green is a lot easier, so you might as well. Okay, well that's looking pretty good. I'm pretty happy with that. And then I'll switch to the Sloyd. That Twca cam, by the way, is made by Belzeboo Crafts. Miguel, I highly recommend his work if you're looking for green woodworking tools. So now I'm basically just going to start refining some curve to this now. So just bringing things back around. Leveling things off. It doesn't need to be, again, this isn't the finishing cuts, so I don't need to be too precious about it. But it is nice to get a good shape while you're here. So what I've done, this is something that I guess it's a stylistic choice of mine. I'll make a little stop cut on the front on either side. And then when I'm doing these longer facets, they'll stop on the sides, but then they'll follow through to the rim of the bowl. It's just a personal preference. In the same way that I've done a hard shoulder, where you can just as easily round that shoulder as well. I just noticed, like I mentioned at the start of the video, there was some grain shake, and there still is a little bit here, so you've got to be really mindful of, if the knife starts to dive in and you don't have a lot of material left, you've got to be comfortable carving the potentially the opposite direction to what you're used to. So there's a little, I can see there's like some kind of residual not grain shake, you know, inclusion, something like that. That's just giving the grain a little bit of a funny feeling. But you just gotta be mindful of where the grain's sitting. And it always gets the grain differentials and things like that do tend to get a little bit easier to deal with when it's dry. But it's just a matter of not having to do as much work when it's dry. I'm just leveling out the back of the bowl. Again, I want to leave some material in case something twists. But this is getting pretty close to where I'll leave it. And then I can come back to it in a few days and commit to some more aggressive lines. Yeah, I'm still feeling that there's just a couple of shaky spots in here that will be easier to deal with when things are dry. And it's good to know when to put things down. just going to finesse this edge just a little bit more. And being nice and light, because I don't want the knife to dive into the grain, which is far too easy to do, especially with silky oak. So being mindful of that is really important. Okay, and then I'm just going to round out these edges. Just to make sure that everything's a little bit more symmetrical and softer. Some potato peeling cuts can be really effective around the front of the bowl. I also like to make sure that I've gotten rid of any of my saw cuts, because I feel like passing over it with a finer edge limits the kind of trauma to the grain. You've kind of polished over it with a smaller knife, whereas with a saw is quite an aggressive cut. So if you leave that and work up to just a saw cut, you're left with some fairly aggressive grain tear. Okay, so the last thing I do, just make sure that these edges are lined up, and then I'll grab the hook knife back up, Twca cam, and just get things a little bit closer to the rim, because when I carved down, I also widened the rim in that kind of third dimensional sense, so I need to make sure that I've gone back. So what I'll do is let's just have a look at my symmetry again, which, like I said, is something that I think everyone is constantly working on. Myself probably more than some. Okay. I'm getting that. Starting to look like a serving spoon. And this is the time where you can really lose track of time and just chip away at the small details. There's no prescribed time to stop or to keep going. It is as long or as little as you are comfortable with. And sometimes I can definitely get a little bit carried away. But because this is the roughing stage, I'm going to restrain myself. Okay, now just getting the Twca cam, and we're just going to run the radius of the spoon, just cleaning up this edge a little bit more. The kookaburras approve. And I'll do it quite thin, because, like I said, with the drying process, I will come back and refine all these edges. But this work can often be a bit of a pain when the wood's dry, so it's nice to get it out of the way. The Twca cam can definitely afford you some different grips. I like to keep the back end on my leg quite often. It gives me an anchor point. It gives me the ability to kind of just position it in potentially a slightly more stable way. And if I can, if it's possible, it's nice to get it completely anchored. You're definitely able to get much more controlled cuts that way. I hope you can see that. Sorry, sit like this for a second. You can bring it all the way across. And my thumb is held down underneath, so it's out of the way of the path of the path of the blade when it follows through. Okay. So I might pick up the Sloyd just once more. Partly because the day's starting to look quite nice and I'm not in a rush to get inside. Okay, so let's go down the center because I haven't done that yet. As you can see from the pencil line. So we'll deal with this center line. And you're really just always looking. That's the key. Is if in doubt, especially because I don't go to a template, I don't carve to a template. Every one of my spoons is different and unique, which I think is what makes them special. But that's just me. I'm kind of on the home stretch of roughing this thing out now, because it's still a little, it chips a little bit when it's this wet. So I'm just going to just take some of these edges off. Do a final run around the bowl. And then anything else can be finished up after the drying process. And the drying process and the finishing cuts during that are the same. It's all the same cuts. I'm just doing maybe slightly more delicate versions of them. But I try not change too much. I'll do a video on finishing cuts for sure. But in the meantime, that's a roughed out spoon, and that'll do the trick. So thank you again so much for being a part of the process and watching what I was doing. It was a real pleasure to be able to actually, talk through my process for the first time. Please consider subscribing and liking the video, and if you have any other questions or comments, please put them in the comment section below. I look forward to, showing you more of what I do in the very near future. So thank you again.